when the crimes all actually really started. Now, to be accurate, I don't think anybody really truly knows except obviously for Cecilia herself. But from what I witnessed and what I experienced since knowing Cecilia back in 2006-7, the crimes had already started back then. In getting to know Cecilia, literally from the first few days onwards, she would often talk about the murders that she had committed in her past. They were basically since her teenage years, the way she stated them, and then going into her early 20s, because I met her, I think she was in her late 20s when I met her, mid to late 20s. But she had bragged, and I do wholeheartedly mean bragged, about how she had murdered people, where she would go into intense detail about how she killed each one, and each one was a vast array of very different methods, all of which were very horrifying and disturbing. Now, slightly touching on a topic that I'm going to cover later, with Cecilia's supposed past and supposedly being remorseful of what she had done in her past and wanting to leave her past, supposedly being from the occult, and always stating that the occult caused and made her and forced her into killing people. There was two dramatically different contrasts going here, because Cecilia would talk about, wanting to leave the occult and not wanting to be roped into doing all of these things. But, and remorseful for having been part of all of it, even though she stated many times she had no choice, which I will cover in another topic. But to the other extreme, when she would relate about how she would kill people, or even how people were killed by occult people, she was thrilled. She would get this undying excitement, this look in her eyes where it was utterly disturbing and confusing. How can you be so remorseful and so desperately wanting to leave the occult, and then shortly after, or even in the same mindset, basically be thrilled and excited about the ways in which she would kill people, and all these murders that had been committed, despite the supposed fact that she was forced to do them, they would be deemed as overkill. But to be honest, I don't think even overkill accurately describes it. It is utterly horrific. I could still relate, which I will in another topic, the ways in which Cecilia would talk about how these people were killed. Incredibly disturbing. And the images, as soon as I talk about it now, the images pop into my mind. And you can't help but visualize this and be disturbed, obviously, at the same time. Well, I say obviously because any normal, decent human being would be disturbed. But Cecilia was thrilled. She would get this undying excitement in her eyes. Her face would light up, and she would laugh, and it was completely confusing. I never asked her why she seemed so excited, because it just didn't feel like the right thing to do. And looking back now, obviously she would either come up with a very dumb justification for why she appeared excited, and also she probably she might just sway it off to, oh no, I'm actually not. There would be a variation of lies that would come with it. Or nonsense reasonings, actually. none of which would actually make sense for the entire scenario of her supposed life altogether. But now going back to the murders and other crimes, as far as the world knows from the investigations and the court case, everyone thinks that the murders were committed from 2016. Actually, I must double check that. Yeah, but the world basically thinks that the murders were committed recently, and within the last several years, but they weren't. These murders had been going on since I was even friends with Cecilia, even though I didn't know, that Cecilia herself was actually orchestrating these murders. For all I know, she could have, in all honesty, been murdering people long before I'd even met her. Those stories that she related to me and to Ria and to the others in her group, they could have actually been real stories, real scenarios that she was part of. I don't have any facts for the things that she had told me about and told us about before we had met her. But if I look at the way she described how these people were killed before any of us knew her, it doesn't surprise me in the very least that in the way in which the overkill murders were done, because they were actually similar. Some of the murders that were related to me in detail during investigation so often reminded me of the things Cecilia used to tell me on how she had done these things in the past. Now, with the court case and the investigation, Cecilia had used Miranda and the others to do the murders, but they were on par with everything she had always talked about when it came to killing people, so it was basically one and the same. And but going back to when I first met Cecilia, it was possibly within the first year, if not the latest, the second year in knowing her, that murders started popping up on Cecilia's radar, or at least around her in some kind of way. Meaning that the people that Cecilia knew, they were killed. They were threatened in very, very disturbing and satanic ways. I remember when it first actually started, Miranda's brother, he would, as far as I understood, he lived on what looked like a plot or a farm, and on the boundary line of this property, there were many occasions where he would find like skulls of an animal and satanic symbols drawn out or displayed using objects. I think it even went as far as, having blood amongst this whole setup. I know that, Miranda's brother had taken photos of the things that had happened on his property, and he would send them through to Ria for help, for guidance, for to figure out what on earth does this mean, what is going on, some kind of insight, and what on earth must he do. I never saw these photos, but I recall Ria talking about them and describing them in detail, and as far as I understand, most of the time there was a ram's horn that was used. A ram skull, and basically any kind of skeleton of an animal that was used always very, very closely came in relation to the main types of animal skulls that were used in satanic practices and in satanic symbols. And this is basically when it first started popping up, at least from what I was aware of. And not too long after, there was other reports, obviously, like I said, none of which I actually knew that Cecilia was involved with at the time, but It was confusing that Cecilia knew these people that it happened to, or she knew the people that knew the people that it happened to, or where the scenarios occurred was too close to where she had lived. There was always some kind of connection. It was even scenarios where it would be related to Ria's ministry, Overcomers Through Christ. There was always some kind of direct link, even if it was a connected dot scenario where it would ultimately end up connecting to Cecilia in some way. And obviously, one or two scenarios and living in South Africa, you can sway off easily to, you live in South Africa and these things happen. But when scenario and scenario after scenario constantly just keeps popping up, it starts to become very questionable. And when these scenarios became a bit too much, why so many? Cecilia would always sway it off to, it's the occult, it's her father making these threats because of her. The occult and her father are trying to scare these people to stay away from Cecilia so Cecilia can be vulnerable to be killed. This was her main reasoning the bulk of the time. Actually, I would go as far as saying in 99% of the time. It always ended with the occult making threats so that everyone that Cecilia knew would pick up and leave, and Cecilia would then be vulnerable to be killed. At the end of it, it all involved something to do with Cecilia. None of us, back in that time period, knew that Cecilia was actually orchestrating these things. Now, back in the very beginning stages, Miranda was already in the picture, but I would probably go as far as be daring enough to say that Miranda was not involved, because Miranda and Cecilia were not exactly close at that time point because I was still in the picture. And obviously I can't be 100% accurate in this, but I have a very strong gut feeling that Miranda wasn't involved in these early stages. Her involvement only became dramatically more once I was out of the picture. I seemed to be a stumbling block or a hurdle or a barrier between Miranda and Cecilia for some reason. I knew Miranda didn't like me because she was jealous that I was Cecilia's best friend, and we always had, as far as Miranda knew, Cecilia and I were very close friends, and we always had the most fun together, and Cecilia shared the most with me. Well, to be honest, now that I say that, that's the reason Cecilia gave me for why Miranda didn't like me. And Cecilia always lied to every member in her group about the other members in her group. So this might not actually be the real reason why Miranda disliked me. In person, Miranda and I got along fine. There was awkward, not scenarios, but we never completely got along. But we were friendly towards each other and decent towards each other. There was no cause for upset or tension, but you could feel and you could sense that we weren't quite happy to be around each other. And in having said that, it could actually just ultimately be because Cecilia would lie to each of us about each of us. Her the general thing that she would do is tell each of us lies. So, for example, and this actually came out after I had left Cecilia and once I'd spoken to Ria, Cecilia used to tell me lies about the things Ria used to say about me. And Cecilia used to do this as well, saying things that Miranda said about me and the other members as well. And then on the other end, she would tell Ria things that I would say about her, and obviously she would then tell Miranda things that I would say about her. But none of these things were actually ever true. Because I know, okay, obviously I don't know Miranda's side of the story on this part, but with regards to me and Ria, all these things were actually, they never happened. We never once spoke ill of any member in the group. In fact, we were actually completely confused why the other members didn't really like us and had so many negative things to say. It was confusing, but it was never confronted. And it was actually it was so dramatic that it created a divide between each person in the group. So much so that we would all just be on the surface friendly with each other, but never stop to talk about deeper issues. Obviously other issues not regarding Cecilia, at least. So we would never talk about, why each of us had an issue with each other. But Cecilia would always tell us, this person says this about you, but don't tell them because I'm not supposed to have told you. So you're kind of betraying Cecilia's trust here, and you can get into trouble and so on. So there was also, I think that would be the bulk of the reason for why none of us actually confronted the other on the apparent disputes within the group. So we were all on the surface fine with each other, friendly with each other, got along with each other, but underlying that, we all had issues with each other. But these issues actually, in all honesty, came because of lies that Cecilia spread between us. But I'm getting a bit off topic here, to cover in another topic later. So, going back to the crimes and the time frame. Now, in the early stages, aside from the mass amounts of threats, to receive displays of objects displayed in a satanic form was not uncommon. Or to receive, which was very, very common, would be text messages, which would be excessively detailed, threatening messages from the occult, apparently, to leave Cecilia, and then giving us ultimatums or telling us what would happen if we don't do what we were told by them. And I was no stranger to these threats as well. I received them very often. They would supposedly come from Cecilia's dad, and from one or two other supposed members in the occult. Ria received a lot of these messages. She received, I would say, the bulk of these threats since before I had even met Cecilia. And Miranda, I know, also received threats, and so did other members of Cecilia's group back then. So threats were normal, actually. They were part of everyday living when it came to just being associated or being in Cecilia's circle. And some of us were alarmed, some of us would laugh it off. Each person's response was different. But as time actually quickly went on, it escalated much more. Not too long after I was actually part of Cecilia's circle, there were reports in the media about the samurai sword killings at a school that's nearby where Cecilia stays. And this school is actually where Ria's ministry team had been to. There was actually too many things relating to this school and this whole scenario that connected Cecilia to the whole thing altogether. And I remember the day that I heard about this, I was standing with Cecilia in her bedroom, and Ria arrived in a frantic state, and she came rushing into Cecilia's room, and she related the whole scenario about the sword killings. And now that her ministry is receiving, this negative feedback and negative overview, and Cecilia's response, I'm not sure even how to describe it. It was so... She looked so unmoved. She just simply looked at Ria, completely carefree, completely careless. She didn't have any emotional response on her face at all. Not a surprised one, not a concerned one, not even a how does a person first usually respond in hearing about information like this, about a kid at a school killing another kid with a samurai sword in tribute to Satan? It's alarming, it's surprising, it's a lot of things. At the very least, your eyes get big and your jaw somewhat drops and you start to ask questions about the whole scenario. And Cecilia's response was completely none of that. She really didn't have any response. It was as if she had no emotion, no thought, no nothing about the whole scenario. It was confusing. And Ria carried on. She was frantic. She was frantic more so for what had happened at the school than the impact or what was being said about her ministry. Ria was in a state. And the more Ria went on about this, the more Cecilia appeared bored and frustrated that Ria just carried on and on talking about this. And it's not like Ria went on for hours or even an hour about this. It was maybe 10-15 minutes at the most. But towards the end of it, Cecilia had this smirk on her face, this sarcastic smile, this weird look in her eyes. And I don't even know why any of us didn't stop to question that look. But by that point, we had all learned not to question Cecilia, which I'll cover in another topic. But later in investigation, it actually came out that Cecilia had orchestrated the whole thing with the samurai sword killings all those years back to when I was still best friends with Cecilia. I was actually still there while she was arranging to kill people for satanic purposes, or whatever purposes were really underlying all of it. I was actually there through all of it. I'm really glad I didn't know, to be honest. Being the best friend of a serial killer is not anything you want to brag about, and I still don't like admitting it. But I can at least say now that I used to be the best friend of one, which is better than saying I am currently the best friend of one. So I'm glad I didn't know that Cecilia was behind all of it back then. And yes, obviously I would have taken off running. But the murder started all the way back then, and that samurai sword killing was done in tribute to Satan. Cecilia had brainwashed this kid into satanic practices, and It was basically an initiation or a way of honoring Satan to gain a higher ranking or more attention from Satan. That's why this kid had to do it. It wasn't because of some threat that, if he doesn't do it, Satan's gonna kill him or do something. But, obviously we don't really know what was said between this kid and Cecilia. But as far as we know, from the whole scenario and the investigations, once everything came out, and also looking back to everything Cecilia told me in that time period I was best friends with her, it would be the general reasoning. So the murders actually started all the way back then. And then there was another killing at a school as well for a similar reason. And between the murder starting and the next murder that I would hear about, there were still more threats towards Ria and her ministry group, Overcomers Through Christ. It was actually too common to actually receive these threats, too common for anyone we knew that posed as a threat for basically removing us out of Cecilia's hold, out of Cecilia's control. Those people would then receive indescribable threats, continuous, countless threats, to get these people to back away from us so that, Cecilia basically can still maintain control over us. And Cecilia ultimately destroyed Ria's ministry within the first 2 weeks of me having met Cecilia. I remember, Ria had this strong ministry team, and suddenly everything just fell apart. Everybody just left. I didn't stop to question why, because I wasn't part of the team, and it was, personal. It had nothing to do with me. But a ministry team fell apart completely within the first 2 weeks. And then Ria then began to try form another one. And again, that one was destroyed. And I watched this repeated pattern carry on for the 4 years that I was best friends with Cecilia. Each person in Ria's ministry was... Look, they were on one side, they would receive threats in order to leave the ministry, to back away from Ria. And then on the other hand, there was the rare, and I say rare scenario, where there would be a person in the ministry that could actually see past Cecilia's lies and try to show Ria the truth. Then, of course, this created a huge war, basically, between Ria and this other person, and even more brainwashing from Cecilia onto Ria, ultimately causing another devastating separation and breakup of the ministry team. And going back to my statement on it being a rare scenario, I say that because I couldn't count even a handful of people back at that time that were not fooled into believing Cecilia's whole story. I honestly couldn't find anyone who didn't believe in the whole story. And the rare person that did, I know they desperately tried to warn Ria, and then that would create the divide between Ria and this person, and Cecilia would also step in herself. These people would receive supposed threats from the occult, and these people would actually, which I found very strange in the beginning, these people would actually take off into hiding. The separation and the break of the ministry team was so dramatic since the first 2 weeks of me knowing Cecilia that these people would actually take off into hiding. And I never understood, since the first time it happened, why would these people take off into hiding? Why would these people take off running even as soon as they saw Cecilia? What was going on? And Cecilia spoke about this many times, how she, had accidentally bumped into so-and-so that was in Krugersdorp, and this person apparently turned white as a sheet and took off running. Now, I had never been with Cecilia in any of these scenarios, so I don't know if it actually did happen. But looking back now, after going through that 4-year period, and even after having left Cecilia, it more than likely could have happened at least once. Because I do remember trying to get hold of some of these people while I was friends with Cecilia, and it was actually impossible. These people, it was like they disappeared off the planet. It was really weird. I had never battled to get hold of them before, and suddenly it was as if they had never existed. So it's more than likely true. But I did start posing that question since the very beginning of the friendship with Cecilia. Why would people take off into hiding from Cecilia? What was so bad? What was so wrong? And I remember Cecilia talking about it right in the beginning, that these people would take off like this because they were scared that the occult was gonna, kill them or do something so utterly devastating if they were seen anywhere near Cecilia or even Ria or anyone in Cecilia's group. That was the bulk of her reasoning for everything when she needed to isolate or get someone out. Further than that, if someone carried a serious threat, that's when more devastating things happened, like overkills. But I'll cover that part in another topic. Now, the next murder I recall is the one of Miranda's brother. Now, up until this point, he had received numerous death threats and displays of satanic symbols and that on his property. In the beginning of his introduction to knowing Cecilia, he got along with Cecilia, and he was in support of Cecilia. But somewhere along the line, and it wasn't, as far as I remember, it didn't take that long, but there seemed to be a tensional rivalry between Cecilia and Miranda's brother. So you could actually clearly tell. I mean, if Cecilia went from liking someone to suddenly loathing them, typically that's when something would happen to that person. And this man, he tried to warn Ria, tried to expose Cecilia. I didn't hear all the details of things that he said, but I remember it being discussed when I was there between Ria and Cecilia. And of course, Ria was brainwashed into believing that all of this was nonsense, and not too long after, Miranda's brother was murdered. Now, I don't know in what way he was murdered, but I can basically easily sum up that it was more than likely an overkill, because revenge killings for Cecilia are always overkill murders. And that was basically the third murder in a very short time period of me being in Cecilia's life. Now, the next scenario that I will relate, I don't in all honesty know if this woman is still alive or not, but it does pose a very, very confusing and interesting lot of questions, and as far as I know, it was part of the investigation. But there was this woman, this receptionist that worked at the doctor's offices near Cecilia, where she would go on almost 2 weekly basis, and I was the person that would normally go with Cecilia. She would go there so often that it was actually tiring, and it wasn't the bulk of the time, the majority of the time, it wasn't even for health reasons. It was just to visit the people there. On the odd occasion, it was actually for something else, like, medical related. But everybody at the hospital, everybody at the doctor's offices there knew Cecilia very well. She was friends with everybody. And obviously, in going with Cecilia so often, I got to know some of those people there, at least by name. And not long after I met this receptionist, it was maybe a couple of months, Cecilia, now this happened in, I think it was the 3rd or the beginning of the 4th year of my friendship with Cecilia. I remember standing on Cecilia's balcony or veranda, whatever you want to call it, and Cecilia relates this scenario to me that happened to this woman. And in that moment, I didn't stop to question, but afterwards I did. Afterwards being after I had left Cecilia, because like I've said in my other notes, you didn't have time to actually stop and think about anything you were told. And what was related to me was that this woman was feeling the desperate need to get attention from her boyfriend. There was some upset in the relationship, and she was potentially going to lose him, and she was desperate not to. So this woman apparently had planned to pose a scenario where she was going to commit suicide in the proper, legitimate way. But she would time it in a manner that her boyfriend would have arrived home just in time, just before she would have officially died, having enough time to have rushed her to the hospital to revive her. So even though this was a full proper suicidal attempt to every degree, there was still more than enough time accounted for in which he would have been able to save her. And there's been the whole setup and reasoning behind it was apparently to dramatically display to this boyfriend that this woman can't live without him and he mustn't leave her. But what had happened, apparently, is this woman had gone through everything to commit suicide, but what she didn't know was that her boyfriend randomly decided to stop off at a bar, which was very unusual for him to do after work. So instead of coming straight back home, he went to the bar. And because he was there, instead of going home, this woman ultimately ended up dying. Like I said, I don't actually know if this woman is still alive or not. I don't know if this scenario was true or not. The one thing that was a very interesting an intriguing question in my mind is, if someone had planned to commit suicide, how would Cecilia know about all these extensive details. I mean, Cecilia went into incredible detail about the whole scenario, about how this woman suffered while she was dying, what was happening to her body while she was dying, what was going through her mind while there was too much detail. How would Cecilia know all these things about a person who was apparently going to commit suicide in secret? I forgot to mention that part. This had never been told to anyone. How did she know if the scenario was actually true? If this woman actually is dead, it wouldn't have been suicide. Cecilia would have killed her. For a reason I would have and could easily have deemed as a revenge murder for, well, any reason. I mean, Cecilia just had to dislike you very much, at the very least, in order to do or try to do something to you. I mean, Cecilia would do horrific things even just to the people that she called friend in her own group. So anybody that was not part of her circle, and anybody that, she did not like, at the very least, she was capable of anything. Never mind if they actually wanted to expose her or try rescue other people out of her circle of friends or her group, however you want to refer to it as. So this woman might be dead, I don't know. But if she is, I can guarantee you that Cecilia did it. It is very easy it's very easy to conclude that she would have been the one. Maybe not the one to have done it personally, but she definitely would have been the one to orchestrate it. Since she didn't seem to like getting her hands dirty after going through all the murders in investigation. But she was very clever that way. And then, aside from the murders, and aside from the horrifying stories of murders that Cecilia would too often talk about, I had seen Cecilia with drugs. Now, in the early stages, possibly within the first 2 years of knowing Cecilia, I'd never once seen her with drugs. But it could have possibly been towards the end of the second year, if not the beginning of the third year of friendship, where I had accidentally been at the wrong place at the wrong time with Cecilia. She and I had been out, and when we came back to her flat, her husband was there and there were 2 police officers. Now, when we walked into her flat, there was not enough time for me to even get a proper, full-on description of what these men looked like, because Cecilia instantly freaked out. And these men, when we walked in, they were facing the opposite direction, so I could only see the back of them, but I could clearly see the uniforms that they were wearing. And but as soon as we walked into the flat and Cecilia realized who these men were, she hurried me so fast to her bedroom. She was in a frantic panic, which was strange. I didn't know what was going on. I mean, her husband was a police officer. These 2 men were police officers. There was no argument going on in the lounge. There was no tension. There was no reason to explain away Cecilia's frantic panic. But she rushed me to her bedroom and she told me to wait there until she comes back. She's going to go to the lounge, to talk to these men to see what's going on. So I waited in her bedroom. And then eventually these men left, and Cecilia came rushing into her bedroom in yet again a frantic state, but more so than before. And this time she was carrying a clear plastic bag. At first glance, I didn't know what was in the bag, and also because I was more focused on Cecilia's reaction and how she was going off and the things that she was saying. I was trying to calm her down, because the usual thing that would happen is if she got too stressed out or too hyped up, she would then have a panic attack or stop breathing, and then whoever was there would have to try and revive her, because she could potentially die. So my first initial focus was on Cecilia's response, not what she was carrying. But as she's carrying on with this frantic episode, she sits down on her bed and she throws out the contents of this clear plastic bag, in which there was 3 more clear plastic bags. And this is when I first noticed and realized what was in these bags. It was drugs. Now, I had never seen drugs at this point, up until this point in my life. I didn't even know what these drugs were. So all I knew is that they were actually drugs, and inside myself I was confused and I was freaking out. Why are there drugs, in Cecilia's bedroom? Why does she have drugs? And then I eventually posed the question to her, and basically what is going on? Because she hadn't related up until this point exactly anything. Just basically that she's going to get in trouble now. She was going on that she's going to get in trouble now if she doesn't do something, and even if she does do something, she could also get in trouble. There wasn't much to go by. But when I asked her, what's going on? Why do you have drugs? And then she, still in her frantic panic state, said that these police officers had instructed her to sell these drugs. And if she doesn't, she's going to get into trouble and be falsely accused and thrown into prison. And now if she gets caught with drugs, basically the same will happen. But now, as she's going on, explaining the scenario still in her frantic state, I'm following her from the bedroom to the kitchen, back and forth, and I'm standing there watching her mix these 3 different types of drugs with other ingredients and pack them into quite a lot of little packets, and then putting them into a red backpack. I didn't quite realize what was going on here because I was still focused on Cecilia's state. But I was still confused enough at this point to, wonder, what is going on now? How is this scenario actually happening? And in this confusion, I eventually did ask her, what drugs are these? And one was cat, one was crystal meth, and one was rocks. I still remember the rocks because it was quite a different shape. But after she had mixed and packed these drugs into little packets and into a red backpack, she told me to wait inside her flat and she's going to come back. Now, up until this point, I didn't realize that my next decision was actually a really good one, because it helped the investigators later on. But I think subconsciously or underlying everything, I knew that something was up, but I didn't know what. And I knew that I had to see where Cecilia was going to put this bag. So I went to one of the spare bedrooms in her flat which overlooked the back parking lot of the flats. Cecilia couldn't see me from this window, and I watched her go to the back, and she opened up her locker there and shoved her bag inside. And as soon as she did that and locked the locker, I quickly went back to her bedroom and acted like I had been in her bedroom the entire time. And then she came back into the bedroom and she made as if nothing had happened and nothing was wrong anymore. Completely different now altogether. I obviously never told her that I had seen where she had put the backpack. She thought by that point I was still completely oblivious. A couple of hours later, Ria came back to Cecilia's flat, and the scenario with the drugs came up. And Ria wanted to go to the police. Cecilia had told her the same scenario that she had referred to, or that she had told me about the police officers. And Ria was frantic, she was angry, she was paranoid, she was a lot of things. But she was very insistent and persistent that she wants to go to the police to report these police officers and this whole scenario. And this is where Ria and Cecilia began to fight. Ultimately to the point where Cecilia had to, and I can now say this, she had to fake a dramatic health problem where Ria then had to revive Cecilia. It was an easy way out of the argument because Cecilia now looked like she had gone into a panic attack, or her heart gave way, so potential heart attack. So basically, stop arguing with me because you can kill me. The general thing that would end all arguments. And Ria dropped the subject. Now, about a week or two later, after this whole scenario, I was with Cecilia and her husband driving around Krugersdorp. And again, in the wrong time, wrong place, wrong time. And because Cecilia's husband was a police officer, he was friends with all the other policemen. And on one of the streets in Krugersdorp, he had accidentally driven up next to the cop car of these same two men. I was in the back seat of Cecilia's husband's car, and they started having, Cecilia's husband and the other two policemen started having a conversation, which was in Afrikaans, and I didn't quite grasp the whole conversation, but this whole scenario at least wasn't a complete loss, because this time round, I could actually identify these men. I got to see what their faces looked like more accurately this time. And the whole time this was going on, Cecilia was very edgy and nervous in her seat. It was very obvious. And then, several weeks after this whole scenario, let me backtrack a little to when Cecilia had walked back into her bedroom with the clear plastic bag of drugs, while she was still freaking out in a frantic state before having unpacked them onto the bed. Cecilia's husband had walked into the bedroom as well. And his response was strange. He looked at Cecilia, he gave her this look as if to say, "What are you on about again? You know, you're full of nonsense again. Like, this is just a typical nonsense freak out scenario." He never said one word, but his look spoke 1,000 words. He looked at her, gave her the look while she was going on frantically. She even went on frantically to him. He carried on with this look. Very disinterested, very just over it. He was just over this nonsense with Cecilia. Although which nonsense, I don't know. Just maybe her frantic, state, perhaps. Because after everything, he didn't seem to have a problem about the whole drug issue after the investigations and that. So it must have just been Cecilia herself that he was over, to be honest. But he didn't say one word, and he just shook his head and he left the flat. And then in the encounter with the other policeman when we were driving in Krugersdorp, her husband Andres was very friendly with these men. They were like the best of friends. There was no tension, no problem, nothing that was alarming whatsoever. But now after those two scenarios, about 2-3 weeks later, there's another scenario that presented itself, which was, I don't know if confusing would be the right word, but it can be swayed off in two different directions. Cecilia had come into contact with a group of people who I was told by Cecilia, aka I could have been lied to about this group, obviously, that this group was trying to eradicate drugs from the area and expose drug dealers. And there were about 3 encounters with this group, I think within a 1 to 2 week time period, and I was there for each one. The first one was just in general meeting. The second one, we actually sat at outside of a guest house with this group to discuss things. But again, they were all talking Afrikaans, and they were talking about drugs. And this is why I can't exactly say if these people were trying to eradicate drugs or deal drugs, because it sounded like they were trying to eradicate drugs. But Cecilia could have easily told them, make it sound like you are trying to get rid of drugs, because Candice doesn't know anything about this, and you obviously have to keep her in the dark, and she could pose as a potential threat, basically just put on a whole fake scenario, and we will talk about other things later. So, like I said, it can be thrown in one of two directions here, because the third encounter becomes more questionable. Now, Cecilia had arranged to meet with this group, but this time I was not allowed to come with. I was not even allowed to wait with Cecilia when she had to wait for them to arrive. Cecilia told me to take her daughter and just drive around Krugersdorp, or even go as far as Key West Shopping Center to entertain her daughter, and she will eventually phone me and tell me when I can come back. I was actually told that I'm not allowed to see this group of people when they arrive or when they leave. I was not allowed to see them at all this time, and they had seen me twice before. Very questionable. And Cecilia she was busy with them for hours. It had actually long past the time in which I had to leave to go home. And I tried to contact Cecilia several times to find out, is she okay? Can I come back yet? And she never answered. Eventually, she contacted me, and I went back to find her. And needless to say, where she had met these people was on a street corner. None of this actually sounded, all of it actually sounded dodgy, let me put it that way. And obviously Cecilia then related to me what had happened, which more than likely could have just been a lie altogether, because she said no, they went to go do a drug bust. Now, in all honesty, after everything that I've been through with Cecilia and everything that I know from the time that I was best friends with Cecilia and during and after the times with the court case and the trial, I'm probably 100% accurate and correct in saying that she probably went to go do some sort of drug dealing with this group, not a drug bust. And then another issue for now, at least, Cecilia's obsession with weapons. In the beginning of knowing Cecilia, she would merely only have a pocket knife, which she would always say is just for safety. Never thought much about it. But as time went on, she would then try convincing me into needing other things for protection, in case the occult breaks into her house or her father. It was always relating to those people, basically. And she asked me to get her a taser. Now, this taser probably could have killed a dinosaur. Obviously an exaggeration, but that's how strong the voltage was on this thing. It wasn't the normal tasers that you actually find for protection. The sound of it alone, I think you could have actually heard blocks away, but it was a couple of 100 volts. If memory serves correct, it was 800 volts. That's a lot. And I think your average taser is between 5 to 10 volts. Again, I never thought much about it because it was for protection. So I was told. The following week after the taser, Cecilia insisted that she needed a new knife. To which we ended up at a knife shop. And Cecilia oohed and ahed over all these knives, obsessively. And I ended up getting another one, again for protection, because she said the knife she had was blunt. And then a week or two later after that, we were again back at the knife shop. The times that I was asked to take her to the knife shop became ridiculous, to be honest. It got to the point where I very quickly would start making excuses because I saw no reason for why she needed multiple knives for protection, where one would be fine, but she never could have enough. And also, I couldn't afford all these knives, but in all honesty, why do you need so many knives? So I started making excuses, so we didn't end up going back. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, and oddly enough, oddly in inverted commas, Cecilia had acquired a samurai sword. I remember the sword standing on its display in her bedroom. She was so proud of this sword. She would take it off the stand and pretend to swing it, and as if she was a professional samurai. I saw this many times. She adored the sword. She was in awe of it. But I mean, it was her prized possession. No one was allowed to touch it, except for her. And then there was a day where I arrived at her house and the sword was no longer there. The stand wasn't even there. And it was very strange. It was very strange. But I quickly forgot about that because life with Cecilia there was just too much to try focus on. So a missing sword, I didn't think much of. Because she could have just perhaps put it somewhere else in the house that I hadn't seen of. But this is when, not long after the sword had suddenly mysteriously disappeared, that the samurai sword killings at the school started. So I can more than accurately say that the sword that the boy used was more than likely Cecilia's sword, because I never once saw that sword ever again after it had disappeared from the flat. And obviously I had never asked Cecilia about the sword either. At that point I would dare not even ask her.